All right, why don't we get started? You can find your seats. So we've all enjoyed listening to Richard Harris over the years on NPR, where he's been science correspondent for the last 25 years and broke many important stories. Most recently, he broke an important story on BP, and most recently, he's returned from Japan and reported on the Fukushima nuclear power accident. So very timely issues that are very important to all of us. So without further ado, Richard Harris.
And today I plan to do what I enjoy doing most, which is asking questions about things that I don't know a whole lot about. And I think sometimes getting back to the basic questions sort of help reveal the structure of what's going on. And today we have an interesting panel of folks talking about the smart grid. I kept thinking as I looked at the title of this the seminar about energy, a summit on energy efficiency, I kept thinking, well, grid efficiency, are we, solar efficiency? I mean, it's all about energy, but I really want to try to tie in the idea of what the grid is going to look like with what it really means in terms of efficiency at the household level, at the utility level, wherever it is. So I'm going to ask all three of our panelists to help us identify a little bit about what we really mean when we're talking about the grid and efficiency. And each one of them will give a short presentation, and then I will engage them in conversation for a little while, and then we will open it up to broader questions. So try to make this a little bit more of a back and forth conversation, and but to lay the groundwork, each person's going to take a couple minutes to introduce what they're doing. I will start by introducing them. Immediately to my right is Paul Martini, who is from Cisco. You can read everyone's bios, of course, are in the program, so I'll just skip further introductions to that. Steve Hauser is from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and he's let's see, I could do a little more titles, I guess. He's Vice President of Grid Integration at NREL, and Paul is the Chief Technology Officer, among other things, at the Connected Energy Group at Cisco. So, to my far right is Chris Knudsen from PG&E. He's the Director of Technology in the Innovation Center at PG&E. And Chris has volunteered to give us a quick, the nickel tour of the grid to start things off, the smart grid, what that really means. And so we will proceed from there. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to talk about some of the things as an industry we don't talk about too much. We talk about all of the solar PV and the home information systems, but we don't talk about the impact that has on a lot of the foundational technologies on the grid. And I think a lot of these technologies are going to be precursors to the ability for these systems to scale and for the grid to maintain reliability. So just a little bit about PG&E. We service 15 million people, 5.1 million electric meters, and 4.3 million gas meters. 70,000 square miles of territory, and you see we have a pretty diversified geography where we cover from the crest of the Sierras through the hot Central Valley all the way to the more moderate coastal regions. So what I have here, this is a little bit, there's a lot of information here, but one of the first things, we talk about smart grid. Well, step back, what's the problem we're really trying to solve? Why is this such a large issue? This is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation's long-term reliability report in 2009. And what you kind of want to look at is these dates here, 2012, 2018, 2018. This is the projected date when the deliverable capacity resources drop below NERC reference margin levels for peak. And you kind of look at the 2006 report, that margin's crossed zero around 2015. It's improved, and it's somewhere around 2018 now, and we attribute that to some demand response programs and actually economic slowdown where folks are actually using less energy. But it's projected to grow in the next 3 years as the economy recovers. So we have this kind of fundamental grounding issue of we as a society are consuming energy at a rate faster than we can generate or produce it. And some of the comments in the earlier panel around the difficulty to site transmission and build generation are a component of that. So Now, what are some of the specific drivers of the technology that we're putting in our system? So, we talk about this imperative here. We've also got, greenhouse gas is another big driver here. There's this, target of bringing greenhouse gas emissions back to where they were in 1990. That's another imperative that's driving this smart grid. If you look at our load peak, in July 25th, I think this is 2006, we hit our peak, and that was only for 51 hours of the day, represents 10% of the total generation capacity within our territory. So there's a huge opportunity here. I think the next metric is that 25% of the generation capacity is only used 25% of the time. So if we can apply technology to shift this, we don't have to build that generation. We don't have to build and maintain that capacity. And then we just have a lot of very real-time pragmatic challenges that are driving us today. Our peak load is currently 2 times our base load. This is kind of the wind curve on multiple days. Every day it's different and it's highly variable. Distributed generation, this is primarily residential photovoltaics, are very concentrated. So we'll have some pockets where we have a lot, some pockets where we have a little. So some of the earlier discussions were talking about large macro averages in numbers, but we have instances on some laterals and some feeders where we have too much solar and we're actually having overvoltage and those inverters are shutting off because that's the way the systems are designed these days. So we have to deal with these localization problems, and we have the same problem with electric vehicle penetration. It's very localized. It's based on demographics and the communities that will buy those. And electric vehicles can represent, one electric vehicle can represent as much as 2 house loads. So that has a significant stress on the local transformers and local distribution lines. So we have this imperative, these opportunities, and these pragmatic challenges, which is really driving what we are doing today with the grid, and it's driving a lot of these long-term initiatives as well. My next perspective here is that the smart grid is really a system of systems. I hear a lot of focus around photovoltaic systems. I hear a lot of focus around demand response programs, a lot around communication for energy efficiency. But I don't hear a lot around how does all of this work as a system? How do we make sure when we put all these pieces together that all of these individuals and companies are working on independently, that they actually play well, that we actually have stable control operation and we don't go into some unstable mode. So this is where simulations and system analysis, and this is something where the research and the industry institutions can play a big part in helping, because other than utilities, there aren't many entities in the industry thinking about how all this works as a stable system. So another big deal here is within the next 5 to 10 years, we predict that the bandwidth needed for just communication across this grid is going to increase on an order of 300%. And we've done some pretty detailed analysis based on what we think as we start expanding more of this functionality across our system, where we're going to have an increase in network capacity. This is not only just adding new network, but it's also evolving the structure of the network to be common across these systems, to use state-of-the-art IP networking and technologies that support security across those networks. And kind of lastly, as we do drive more of these distributed resources on the grid, the load profile or the load becomes more dynamic and more complex. So today, 20 years ago, we had a pretty smooth generation profile. We would just add more generation if we had more load coming on. Well, as we put all of these dynamic sources and loads on the grid, the rate of change and the peak to average ratio of that load increases dramatically. So we have to figure out how we manage that. And what we've done historically is in our lines of business in the utility and generation and customer and transmission and distribution, enterprise application and mobile workforce, we've kind of built isolated systems. But what we have to do going forward is exemplify some of the best practices in communication architectures that span this and security architectures that span this and probably most importantly, information architecture. So how do we make all these systems talk the same language, and how do we make sure all of the data is coordinated and maintained? So kind of the key points I want to exemplify here is that the generation and load are becoming more complex, and we really need to start thinking this in terms of the smart grid as a system of systems and how they're integrated. More devices, more data, more information. We're going to migrate towards IP networks, layered architectures, common information models, and structured compliance and testing around those, all based on standards and industry standards, and really driving interoperability across vendors, which is something that doesn't necessarily exist well today. And lastly, this is going to be a long road. This is 10, 20, 30, 40-year road. There's no way we're going to be able to predict, the Twitters or the iPhones or the Googles that are going to be around in 2030. But what we can do is we can build and design a system that enables them. So, how do we make sure we apply these best practices from a system view around the grid as we build it so that we can empower innovation in the market and all of the things we're talking about here to be successful. Thank you.
If I could ask you to talk a little bit about a couple of issues that we've heard a little bit about already this morning, which is some of these issues about how you integrate electric vehicles and intermittent power supplies and sources and so on. Because I think that's obviously, if this is going to work, we've got to think about what the world's going to look like coming ahead. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard and Chris, both, and good morning, everyone. I could almost just say ditto to what Chris just said, because we didn't really compare notes ahead of time, but a lot of what I am going to say is very much similar to what Chris just said. Hopefully I'll say it slightly different, so you'll get a few different key messages and takeaways that'll add to the discussion that we have over the next hour or so. And fortunately, I'm going after Ryan, so I also, like Ryan earlier this morning, included a couple of obligatory slides on NREL. I'll just refer these to you. I won't go into detail. The point is that NREL does, well, we do a lot of solar energy research, which is Ryan's area that he talked about this morning. We do a lot of other things at NREL as well. And our staff has gone up and down over the years, but right now we're at an all-time high of around 1,800 or so staff at NREL. Dr. Brinkman this morning talked a little bit about these long-term goals that the administration has. Those are certainly drivers for our mission at NREL. And we look at all the different systems from fuel, transportation, the built environment, buildings, electricity generation and delivery. We look at how all of these integrate together. And so integration to us crosses all of these. There's a study done in the last year or so at the Department of Energy that looked at how do we reach these goals over the next 40 years. And one of the key takeaways, I won't go into details on that study, but one of the key takeaways was that, well, overall energy use over that 40-year period will remain roughly level. That's one of our goals. There'll be a lot of energy that's switched from transportation fuels into electricity, meaning that the electricity system will have to accommodate as much as a 50% growth in demand over the next couple of decades, which is really key to the to the smart grid message. You've probably heard some of this before, and certainly this is, Chris alluded to this. I think we're on the brink of a major change, major transformation in the utility industry over the next decade. There's a lot of different drivers to that, and Chris mentioned several of those. If you think about what the grid looks like today, it looks a lot like what it's looked like over the last century. We've basically built out the system to accommodate growth in demand so that consumers, you and I as a consumer, if we went to the store and bought a new television, a new, in my case, a new Xbox for my son, we came home and plugged those in. We expected the utility to have built the capacity and built the ability to deliver that electricity to our homes anytime, anywhere, and as much as we wanted to use. Going forward, the system has to look very different. It becomes this complex adaptive system, which Chris alluded to, that is much more information rich, moving from what I call a megabyte world to a petabyte world or beyond. It's going to be much more distributed in its design and operation. Clean tech's a priority, as we've heard much of this morning. Storage becomes essentially ubiquitous over time. That's obviously a technology challenge for us. Operations become highly automated. Energy services become highly differentiated. And consumers become much more participative in this grid of the future. So Chris already mentioned systems of systems. Again, we didn't talk about this ahead of time, but it's clearly one of the concepts that's catching on in the smart grid world and across the industry is the fact that these subsystems become so important in terms of how these integrate, and the issues, the research and development issues that are beginning to emerge now have to do with effective design and management of the interfaces of all these different technologies and subsystems. So I've got a lot more slides that would go into much more detail, but Richard asked us to keep our comments short, so I'm going to refer the other slides to you offline, and if you have any questions about them, either during the conference or later, I'd be happy to discuss a lot more details about some of these integration issues. But I'm going to end with this slide, which highlights some of the needs, which Chris has already alluded to a little bit, but the ability to predict variable resources with much greater certainty, to provide integrated forecast information across multiple resources and integrate this information into decision and operational tools. That's clearly one of the goals of this grid integration going forward. Models. Our models are antiquated at best. Many of the models we use to operate the grid now were developed 20 years ago or more. We've certainly increased their level of sophistication over time, but we've got to develop a whole new generation of models that are much more distributed, much more complex, much more localized in the way they're used. Advanced communication control systems, I assume Paul's going to talk a lot more about that. Cost-effective storage, obviously, has been talked about already this morning, and additional materials. We're going to see new technologies, smart transformers we're starting to hear more and more about, diamond coatings on transformers that make them much more sophisticated and much more able to operate efficiently, and many other technologies too. So with that, I'm going to end and turn it over to Paul.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to come and share a little bit about what we're doing at Cisco and in this context of connected energy. And as Chris touched on, certainly from a grid perspective, we certainly see the opportunity to develop products and solutions to address the communications need. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but sort of focus on a couple of other things. There are these major trends that are happening that are going to affect energy, and there's just a few. We've already talked about the aging infrastructure, and we've obviously a lot of focus this morning on clean energy and sustainability, but a couple of the other things that are also affecting how we think about energy, and certainly as we consider both the economics and the policy dimensions, and some of the technologies that need to help support are around the aging population, the number of people on fixed income, and not just in the United States, but around the world, and as well as urbanization. This is a really significant issue in lots of the parts of the world, but even increasingly in the United States, we see more urbanization happening. As a result of many of these drivers and some of the other discussion points this morning, it's pretty clear to us at Cisco that we need to start thinking a little differently around energy strategies as it relates to things like policies, and to in the regulation, as well as new business model opportunities as we think about how to unlock the value in terms of what we're discussing here. Now, one of the things that we look at, obviously, are how many connected devices do we see evolving over the next decade. And Based on a fairly recent analysis, Cisco is looking at by 2013 that we'll have about 1 trillion connected devices to the internet. 1 trillion connected devices from 300 million just a few years ago. Now, how does that relate to what we're talking about here? If you go back to Chris's slide, if you go back to some of the discussion this morning, most everything will be connected as it touches energy. And now that means that there's a lot to be done in terms of what both Steve and Chris were talking about, is how do we integrate all those into a cohesive system that can manage this integration on a much more dynamic basis. Many of the systems that we have for integrating end-use energy, whether it's demand or supply, is relatively passive as it relates to the operational systems that both manage the markets and manage the physical network. The other is that the physical network and the market are largely abstracted from each other, and certainly on the distribution level. And as we start to look at more distributed resources, whether they be supply or demand, it's going to be increasingly important that we do start to link these more dynamically so that we can maintain grid stability over time. This is a fairly interesting and pretty significant challenge that a number of folks in this room and others are working on. Now, many of you have obviously think about these things, and it was touched on both by Steve and Chris. We see several waves of evolution of this grid over the next 20 plus years. I think the one thing, not any one topic is necessarily that interesting, but it's more the quote that we've borrowed from Gibson, which is that the future is already here. Often we talk about 20 or 30 years, and the reality is, as Chris touched on, we're already seeing issues in certain pockets around things like voltage rise or some potential power quality issues around concentrations of PV installations on distribution. Because often there's this tendency to talk about at the macro level, as was actually on the first panel, talking about, well, it's not a problem once you get to, until you get over 15%. Well, we've already reached that at the distribution level. From a grid perspective, from a customer's experience perspective, it's really local. They don't experience so much the macro, except when there's large events. A lot of this is actually at the distribution level or regional transmission, and this is where there's an opportunity for us to be thinking right now how to solve these problems, not what's going to come in 10 years. We're already having to address these issues today. And certainly as this goes over time, we'll increasingly have to look at these. Fortunately, I think in the U.S. with the ARA projects on demonstration, as was touched on earlier, both Steve and Chris talked about this, and Linda on the prior panel about opportunities to look at distributed storage, what virtual power plant might look like. And many of these functions that we're talking about here are encompassed in a lot of those demonstration grants, and so we'll have a tremendous opportunity over the next couple of years to really see how this can be integrated. Now, we look at something we call gridonomics, which is how do we think dynamically the economics, the value economics, the policy, and the technology tie together in shaping how we move forward successfully, both in terms of advancing public policy, as was talked about earlier, but also how do we make sure that there are sustainable business models that can be addressed. Now, this is a slide that comes out of a broader presentation on some analysis that we did recently looking at 3 states in the United States that represent kind of the bounding conditions. One is Georgia, which is a very vertically integrated state in terms of its market structure. Texas, which is disaggregated, and California, which is kind of a hybrid. There's a little bit of competition in the retail space, and obviously generation has a fair amount of competition. So kind of looking at this. We did an analysis with one of the leading management consulting firms looking at dispatch model and then a conceptual cost-benefit analysis that we've modeled that we put together. And we identified a fairly large amount of value at stake. This is a 15-year net present value analysis. So $62.5 million. The cost of implementing against that would be about 28. The net societal value is about 35 billion, I should say, that in terms of NPV over that period. Now, when you start to break that down in terms of how that would get allocated across the various stakeholders, whether it be from a customer standpoint, a competitive retailing function, what might accrue to a T&D, both transmission, separately distribution, generation, both competitive and regulated, and then any uncaptured value, you start to see that we've got this bit of a problem that is very much a sort of winner-loser proposition. The other thing that we have is that this is really a zero-sum game. One of the things that many of us that look at business models in this industry for now going on a couple of decades is that we keep bumping up against the fact that there's a winner and a loser in this proposition. And one of the things we're looking at is how do we start to think differently about monetizing this value? Because much of the value that we ascribe, and most of this is associated with energy efficiency, whether it's created through a smarter grid or from an end-use efficiency, but we need to find a way to monetize this so that the investments get made. As we've heard on prior panel, there's a lot of capital investment that's required. So how do we incent people to go after that, build the products, put the infrastructure that's needed when we're really creating not the most attractive business models for folks? So how do we think differently about it, something that we're spending a fair amount of time on? Now, switching gears completely and kind of building off where Chris was talking about on communications infrastructure, we clearly are also looking at how we think about cybersecurity and securing all of this, not just from the grid perspective, but down to the end use. So how do we think as this goes over time in this system of systems, how you start to think about security from this holistic perspective? It's a very complex issue, but something that we spend a fair amount of time on, and really from this overall life cycle approach. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So thanks very much for that. Let me. I think your point about the financing, how this works economically, is worth spending a little bit of time talking about. I mean, it sounds as though according to your slide, the people who are most likely to gain are consumers at this point, but they are also probably least likely to be pounding on the table demanding a smart grid. In fact, I think we see consumers, if anything, indifferent or in some cases not wanting these kinds of new technologies. So do you have ideas about what you could do to make this a sort of an economically appealing proposition for businesses? Who should be driving this if not consumers?
Well, we do see that, and maybe if we took customers and broke them into sort of two buckets. One is commercial, industrial, and governmental. Clearly, they're moving ahead around a lot of these investments with respect to, because of the amount of energy they consume, and it's very cost effective for them in many cases to start implementing, as well as this renewed focus on sustainability has really driven a lot of companies that might otherwise have invested in certain energy efficiency projects to, given sort of historical hurdle rates that they've used for these projects, have started to allow a few more projects to get through those capital reviews. On the residential side, the big problem is that the percentage improvement in terms of energy efficiency may be not enough to motivate that individual to be able to go ahead and make that choice, as well as the fact that a significant number of residential customers are actually in rental property, and a lot of the infrastructure that's required is not something that they would directly benefit from in terms of improvement to the property. So how do you align those incentives is one. The other is because the amount is so small, how do you get people to, services companies, to be able to make sufficient money given the customer acquisition cost? So when you start to break this down, you start to see that it gets to be quite expensive to get after that amount that looks to be quite large, but the cost of acquiring those customers, supporting those customers, and the like can be quite challenging. So this is an area where I think a number of us are starting to try and take that apart and say, are there other ways to create value outside of that zero-sum game, right? Can we expand the pie in such a way as to add more value so that it is cost-effective to go after and serve those customers?
Yeah, I want to ask the other panelists also on
Well, so one of the real values of creating a smarter grid going forward is that we're going to have the ability to understand consumers much better than we have in the past. So, in the past, we sort of tend to group them all together, or at least we group them as residential and commercial consumers. The fact is we're all different. We all use electricity very differently. We all have different ways of wanting to manage our electricity, and applying the same kind of applications that are being used in other markets to consumers and applying them to electricity is going to really create a much richer set of applications that consumers can use for their own particular needs, right? So how you get me to reduce my energy use or manage it differently is probably very different than how you would get Chris or Paul or Richard to change, because we use it differently. We have different demographics in our household. I like to say, if you want to get my house to change how it uses its energy differently, you have to get it my 14-year-old son, and the way to get to him is through his Xbox. So if you get an app on the Xbox and get my 14-year-old son interested in reducing our energy use, it'll change. If you're trying to get myself or my wife or my 14-year-old daughter to do that, it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah. So Chris, what do you think? Does PG&E see this as a huge opportunity to make money?
Well, I'm a technologist, not an economist, so take my answer at your own risk. But my whole career has been working in emerging technologies and new technologies in markets that are undefined. Everybody's always asking what's the killer app, and there usually never is a killer app, right? But I am a big believer in the Crossing the Chasm, Jeffrey Moore's book, and the concept that for technologies to scale and really provide value and reach mainstream adoption, they need to be painkillers, right? Especially when we're talking about the consumer or the customer side. And those, typically those products, the big utilities, those of us that are working on these real macro problems that are facing us today aren't the ones that figure that out. And that goes back to my last comment on the slide, is that to enable to drive this, we need to create a system that allows innovation, that is based on open standards, that allows these customer interfaces and customer markets and large vendors that do our enterprise and our back-end systems to integrate and interoperate based on that definition. And do I believe there's opportunity? I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to technology. So absolutely, I believe it's there. But I believe it's one of those ones that, one of those things that we have to go forward, and we will gain clarity as we understand it more, as we develop more technology, as we develop these best practices around our architecture and allow the industry to innovate and the best of breed to bubble up, so to speak.
Yeah. Let me take an example that we heard a little bit more earlier this morning, which is about batteries or storage in general. So let's say you have the smart grid that can store some of the energy in some form. Who would own the batteries? Would somebody make money by having the battery? It seems as though from a utilities perspective, it's a bit of a headache to have to deal with intermittent power supplies. And so then having to spend more money to address the headache doesn't really seem like an appealing option for the utility. But would that be in the cards? Or because a grid obviously is not owned by any single entity. Or do you have an entrepreneur? Do you set up the grid in such a way that an entrepreneur can then basically build this and get money back somehow or other?
I'll make a quick comment, and then I think Steve has got some detail on this. But I think it's all of the above, right? And I think a battery is just another type of generation. And if that technology matures and it's an effective, easy to operate tool, if it scales, then it's a very logical choice. And that could be utility scale. And if you could get it cost effective to go in the home, it could be a home-based entity. So I think all of those possibilities exist. It depends on the maturation of the technology and the cost and performance metrics for those technologies.
I like Paul's quote that he had up there, the future's already here, it's just not very well distributed. If you counted how many batteries are in this room right now, it's probably a couple hundred batteries, right? So we already have ubiquitous storage. It's just that we haven't harnessed it for the grid yet, right? And the economics are clearly a part of that. And as the panel this morning talked about, or maybe Dr. Brinkman talked about, there's a number of options being looked at that'll help the economics, certainly going forward. But I think the challenge is, how do we network these devices together in a way that we can really make best use of them?
And I guess part of this comes down to standards, because if you're going to have various people chiming in the way we are on the internet, people, anyone can build a website as long as you follow the internet protocol rules, right? Same thing must be the case on the grid. How far along are we for having that kind of IP equivalent on the grid?
I think we're pretty close. The work that's been going on for quite some time, but on a concerted effort over the last couple of years under the direction of the NIST as coming out of the statute, the 2007, the ISA. This work that now is a group, the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel, so it's a group of about 600 different organizations that have come together, very cross-section of industry, utilities, both investor-owned and public power, technology firms, services firms, folks from the national labs, research institutes, as well as universities, all participating in how to shape the evolution and accelerate the development if they don't exist, or the refinement of existing standards to be able to address the very issues that we've been talking about.
Yeah. So is it to the extent that a company could come along and say, well, gee, I want to get into the power storage business, store it when I buy it when it's cheap, and then sell it back to your utility when it costs more? Does the grid allow that? I mean, so you obviously first need the language, but you also need to have other kinds of agreements between utilities and these private companies. I mean, are you looking at sort of the internet in any way as a model for doing those kinds of things?
The transaction aspects may be a little less than in terms of the internet, maybe more so in terms of the protocols that have been established for some time on how generation interacts with the grid, although there are some differences as we start to look at, because storage does have, it's not just an energy source, it does have some other attributes that have been touched on today that are more capacity oriented, that really look more like grid type functions. And so, trying to understand, I mean, because it has this dual nature, even the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has had a little bit of a challenge trying to categorize, does it fit neatly in this bucket or that bucket? And so how do you really determine the best way to think about integration?
Yeah.
I think, if you look at standards, I mean, there's an infinite number of standards in the industry, and I think we're actually pretty mature relative to the communication protocols and a lot of the security protocols to allow information to flow from point A to B and the mechanisms to do that. I think where we have a lot of work is in more of the application messaging and alignment on the business process that these different systems will use. And maybe I'll highlight an example. So, again, this morning we talked about all these different solar systems and these inverters. Well, the different companies all have their different inverters, but to what extent have they decided how they maybe locally make fairness decisions? So if, I'm on the end of a court and all three of us have a solar system, and I'm the last guy that gets the sun, maybe the voltage is already too high, so my system can't come on. Well, it would be nice if all three of those systems could communicate to each other and decide to ratchet back in a uniform way. And there's discussions, this is happening in industry, but those are some of the examples. We have to define standards so that these systems that are going to be on the grid across vendors can interoperate, and there's levels of compliance and regulatory structure that have to be put in place. So I think that's where the heavy lifting is relative to standards, and we're back to the theme of how do these systems all work together.
Yeah. And so one of the things we hear about occasionally on the smart grid is you could have a manufacturer could come along with a washing machine that would only turn on when the power was relatively cheap. If you have pricing based on what it actually costs the utility to supply the electricity, is that something that I mean, presumably that requires these standards?
Yeah, it does, or you could even postulate that, let's say that the cloud comes over the solar system and your dryer is running, and locally you would make the decision to stop that dryer from running at that time, right? So you could mitigate. Storage is one solution, but there's also other areas we can explore for mitigation of some of these load balancing challenges.
And Steve, I want to ask you about electric cars a little bit, because I think they interact with the grid in a couple of ways, one of which is they're going to demand a lot more power, as we've heard, but also some people talk about them as these huge batteries out there, that if people would be willing to basically lend their car batteries to the grid for a time, that could work too. Is it?
So there's a lot of innovation going out around the industry in sort of pilot scale studies. One of the slides I didn't get to in my presentation is my school bus slide, right? So PJM's talking a little bit about now about doing hybrid electric school buses, because the use of school buses sort of matches well with the fact that the grid may be able to use these batteries when they're sitting idle at night or in the afternoon, right? So I think the number that PJM quotes is that if you hooked all the school buses in the country to the grid, you'd have about 90 gigawatts of capacity, battery capacity, which is about 10% of our total grid. That's pretty impressive, right? And the economics look pretty good for something like that. So I think, cars are obviously next. The challenge is a little more difficult because we all like to drive them anytime we want and not have them necessarily connected to the grid when the grid might want to use them. But it's certainly an opportunity to do that.
And PGM is?
PJM is the grid operator in the Mid-Atlantic, the Philadelphia and surrounding area. It's actually the largest grid operator in the world.
Yeah. So let me step back and ask you an even broader question, because everyone we've heard this morning, I mean, this is an energy efficiency meeting, right? And there are, I'm sure, people in the audience who say, if we play our cards right, we actually need less electricity because there's so much waste already in the system. But all these conversations this morning have been predicated on the assumption that we're going to need more and more and more electricity. I mean, first of all, help me understand that, and second of all, help me understand if that's indeed the case, or if we could actually create much more efficient use of electricity, would we actually need to upgrade the grid?
Two quick comments on that. I think the first one is there certainly are inefficiencies in the grid. So for instance, as we evolve, let's say, the smart meter systems and the information we have there, and we actually have to evolve the distribution system infrastructure to do this, but you can regulate more effectively so you're not having, just guessing what the voltage is at the end. You can actually regulate, and there's 2, 3, 4%, some would estimate there that we could save. Another big driver, and this again goes to communication on the consumer side, is home entertainment systems, TVs, computers. Those are on order of 8% of usage and load. So the whole industry getting more efficient there, and communication systems so that they can be asked to reduce when at need are opportunities. So I keep coming back to the theme of integrating and systemizing this whole thing.
I think the big issues I mentioned earlier is the transportation sector. So, there's studies done that have shown that we can meet our future economic growth without increasing the amount of energy that we use, just by efficiency, no question about it. But if we want to radically reduce our petroleum imports, we've almost certainly got to transition transportation more to the electricity sector, which means a growth in electricity demand over the next couple of decades. Now, how much growth? That's a big question, but it's certainly not going to be trivial.
Right. I think the question really comes down to reducing the rate of growth in demand. Unfortunately, the rest of the country, or even most of the developed world, is unlike California, which has maintained per capita consumption relatively flat over a 20-plus year period. And so the opportunity is, with what we're talking about here in terms of energy efficiency, is how to reduce that rate in the other parts of the country and maintain that level of consumption, keeping that flat here in California for an extended period.
And how much does sort of the efficiency that the grid can provide, how much does that depend upon changing human behavior and getting people aware of how much power they're using? I've seen various systems where it tells you, you can do lots of things to help people monitor their power, and particularly if you have variable pricing, then all of a sudden you can create incentives for people to do stuff. Do you need to have that kind of stuff in the smart grid in order to make it work, or can you actually improve efficiency and have it invisible to consumers and have them and require no action? Because of course most of us would rather not spend a lot of time thinking about how to shave a few pennies off of our electricity bill.
Well, as was touched on, Chris mentioned this, I mean, there are a number of types of ways to think about efficiency, both efficiency in terms of the production of energy, efficiency in the delivery of energy, how much reducing the losses in the system, and then and reducing losses at the end use, but also people's consumption, of reducing their consumption of energy. So all of those come together. Certainly in terms of the grid, the numbers that Chris talked about, when you talk about potentially 3 or 4%, it doesn't sound like a lot until you say that can be done fairly seamlessly and relatively cost effectively across the entire grid. And as a result, you're looking at very large numbers in terms of actual gigawatt hours that could be reduced.
Yeah, and does a company like PG&E get to keep that money if you find savings? I mean, this is part of the issue also. It's their regulated utilities, right? So there are some actual disincentives for built into the system also.
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, there are different regulatory structures across the country, but PG&E in California, we're decoupled, so we don't make any money on the sale of energy. You know, our money is really tied to the deployment of capital around, you know, projects and work that we do, and a percent on top of that. So we are motivated to drive technology. That is our direction from the CPUC to find these efficiencies and put systems in place to achieve those goals.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. Are there microphones floating around out there? Here's a microphone coming toward you. One moment.
Thank you. Roland Bryan from Solar 3D. This has been an exciting conference right up to now. More information has flowed here than is available to the general public. So when Stephen says that we're understanding the consumers better and we have to understand them better, can we turn that over and say, how do we get the consumers to understand what you want to do better? Because that's the way you'll get the support, I think.
Well, that's an excellent point, and one that many are actually struggling with right now in terms of how do we communicate effectively around the relevance of energy and tying to these policies and what that means in terms of their day-to-day activities, whether it's a business or an individual. And this is not an easy question to answer, because for a lot of people, I mean, there's been a lot of studies done in terms of breaking down the segmentation of customers, individual consumers, in terms of what their interests are. And there clearly is a fairly significant percentage that do focus and are aware of both sustainability issues, as well as their focus on reducing their energy cost, more from even just managing their monthly bill. As I mentioned, increasingly the number of households that are on fixed income, whether because of retirement or because of just where they are in a socioeconomic situation, is increasing. And as a result, people are becoming very focused on energy, which, you know, for electricity or other natural gas, is a fairly significant component of what their monthly expenses are. So this is becoming more aware, but how do you then get them to take action beyond that, I think, is where a lot of people are trying many different concepts to try and tap into that.
Paul alluded to the fact there's 131 Recovery Act projects going on around the country right now. And while some of those are in Houston and San Diego and Miami, a lot of them are in Quincy, Florida, and Marlborough, Massachusetts, and Napierville, Illinois, and so on, right? There's projects all over the country. A lot of what's being learned in those projects is how to engage consumers better, provide them information to help them understand how to use the information to manage their energy better. Also, if you're interested, go to smartgrid.gov. There's more and more consumer-facing information that'll be up on smartgrid.gov in the future, as well as the Department of Energy is now launching a series of regional meetings and consumer outreach focused projects that I think will help address that.
Do you get? Oh, yeah, I'm
I
sorry.
was going to say, you know, and another mechanism, because of the standards process, the NIST efforts, some of the UCA Open Smart Grid, we as utilities and vendor communities collaborate on the work product defining these standards. So as we're doing these pilots, the learnings get fed into the standards process, and then, you know, we harmonize those into a common view of what's needed and what's not needed in these technologies, what drives value, what doesn't drive value.
Yeah, Steve, do you have a sense of how much consumers sort of regard this as just something that makes it easier for the utilities to bill them, as opposed to something that actually benefits them? I mean, I guess the public face of the smart grid is really the smart meter, right? And that you know, I think it's had a somewhat of a checkered history in its early days.
I agree with what you said in its early days. I think that's changed a lot in the last year or two. So a lot of these projects I was talking about that are Recovery Act funded are being very innovative at engaging consumers and educating them how to, you know, understand how to use this to benefit themselves, the consumers. Oklahoma City is very progressive in this area. As well as Napierville, Illinois, and so on and so on. So it's not the same approach that we saw maybe 2 years ago. I think it's much more innovative now.
And I, anecdotally, I mean, these are not statistically relevant data sets, but, we've done pilots where we've put home area networking devices into homes. We've had it come through the smart meter, and we've provided that information. And, one of the things you see is we just, little magnet on your fridge that has your usage. And anecdotally in our house, if I see that number is at a certain level, I know, we left the garage lights on. And it has definitely changed my behavior and my wife's behavior and family behavior. Is I have a 3-car garage and one light switch with a lot of lights in there, so there's about 600 watts, right? That's on. And you just know, right? So you see that number's wrong and you go flick the switch. So I think there is a lot of opportunity. I think the technology is very nascent now, but as it matures, I think we'll see more of this and we'll share the learnings across industry.
And it sounds like somebody has a market to sell you some solid-state light bulbs, too, for your garage. More questions? I can't see who has a microphone, so if you have one in your hand, use it.
Hello, Severin Boyke from Germany. We have a number of bigger projects running in Germany at the moment on smart grid. And it appears that the actual load shifting seems to be a much bigger market than the overall efficiency. And I wonder how that would be in the US and, especially in California.
Well, the load shifting or addressing the relatively poor load factor, system average load factor in the US is a pretty big deal. And it's not just the US, as you touched on. There's also an issue in Australia and in several other places. The numbers that Chris showed, I think Linda may have touched on it this morning. In some places, California in particular, but at other places around the US, you have a system average load factor that's somewhere near 50%, with a peak that is occurring, as Chris's note, 51 hours out of a year. That's like if you ran an airline and you had your planes half full except for one weekend out of the year. That's not an effective way to manage a lot of capital infrastructure that is out there. And particularly when we look at, for example, the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade association for the investor-owned utilities in North America, they're projecting that over the next 20 years, about $1 trillion in both transmission and distribution infrastructure. Now, some of that has to do with integrating the renewable resources that was talked about earlier, but a lot of it has to do with replacing existing infrastructure that is aging and the like. And some of that could be deferred and certainly maybe shaped more effectively if we were able to address this the system average load factor. Now, battery technology, some of the other things we're talking about in terms of being able to have more effective energy consumption certainly can help address this, but this is a big issue.
Yeah, no, I see, and this is looking out there at 10, 20 years, but I think Richard brought it up. Does this just have to be seamless so that, this happens without the consumers really being aware of having to do anything? I think he's right on. But, I predict eventually you'll have the appliances and the load devices all networked in some regular grid state condition that, probably is relative to where you are, sending a signal, and that device is doing things to better the equation. And I think that has to be a competitive factor in devices and appliances. I think it has to become kind of a trend like on recycling. You look 30 years ago, we weren't all recycling. Now it's, if you're not recycling, you're kind of the odd person on the block. So I think there's a lot of that is going to be part of, where we're going in the next 20, 30 years on these systems.
Yeah. So do I have to worry about someone hacking into my refrigerator, though?
I think this is where, the application of the technologies, Internet Protocol type technologies and other things that we've learned over the last decade in terms of securing those systems can be applied. Certainly there's a lot to be brought to bear, and I think as Chris touched on, that's what most of us are looking at is how do we move to more of that, moving away from proprietary closed systems to much more robust IP-based communication systems that we can have these highly secure infrastructures.
Okay, more questions. Thank you.
Doug Crawford with the Navy League of the United States. The Department of Defense is one of the largest energy users, and they've mandated that there be an elimination of 50% of all carbon-based fuels by 2020. They have been moving very aggressively in that way and also reducing the amount of energy consumption on the bases in Southern California, about 20% over the past 4 years. The question is, as a solution, power purchase agreements have been starting to get developed in around the country. There's now hundreds of power purchase agreements, private ones being developed and implemented. Can you speak to, as you think of your planning on the smart grid, can you speak to what impact positively or negatively those power purchase agreements and the shifting use of power by one of our largest power users will have on the smart grid?
Well, one of the things that I think that we're going to be looking at, and sort of a different variation on standards, and that is the operating standards about how the various resources would need to integrate into the system. I touched very briefly on this, but today, largely resources are only looked at from a market transaction standpoint, from the wholesale market perspective. And increasingly, as we get more and more diversity in the number of both either demand or supply side resources, we have to start to think about the implication on the physical network as well. Those things need to be considered at the same time in a lot more detail than they are today. So what does that mean? I think that we will start to see power purchase agreements over the next decade or this decade and beyond, starting to take into account much more specifically some operational requirements related to the physical flow of electricity on the network, much more so than they are today. Typically, the PPAs are largely a variation of what was developed 15 years ago when the markets first opened up. And I think we'll see more integration of these operational dimensions that will mean that, Chris touched on this at the residential level, but the same thing exists at the larger commercial, industrial, and governmental facilities. So how do those resources integrate into a grid?
Yes.
Thank you. Stan Kohler from Maryland. 10 years ago, there was an incredible amount of excitement with regard to fuel cells, powering everything as small as cell phone batteries to automobiles, homes, and small cities. And I hear nothing about them today. And particularly the relevance would be for grid backup in terms of when there's an overabundance of energy production, say from a wind turbine, electrolyzing water, creating hydrogen, and then running the hydrogen through fuel cells. Is there any potential for that? Have we abandoned fuel cells, or are there still players? Or are batteries the current status quo?
One of our sponsors is a fuel cell company, I believe, so I think they certainly haven't gone away. As with any emerging technology, there's always challenges to get into the market. I think one of the things that we're going to see more and more of, I believe, as the smarter grid evolves, is the ability to identify niche markets where certain technologies can really provide that high value. One of Paul's slides alluded to that, I think. And so hopefully we can identify those markets, quickly enough to keep these companies going.
Right. I think one of the things we're going to see, certainly policies like in the state of California around zero net energy buildings, whether it's residential or commercial, or near zero net energy, and California's not alone. We're seeing that in many places, certainly the effort by the Department of Defense around these kind of activities in terms of more self-sufficiency in terms of the end-use premise, will drive the potential for things like fuel cells, which might lend themselves, as Steve said, to nice applications where you need continuous power. So things like data centers and 24-hour operations ties into some of the reliability concerns or needs of that kind of facility. So there's a lot of different applications where they can fit nicely, certainly in combined heat and power applications and the like. So as Steve said, there's more than one technology that will be brought to bear to achieve these outcomes that we're seeing from a public policy standpoint.
More questions? I see some hands in the back.
How close are we to real-time price of power changing as a function of how much it costs to produce it? It seems like that's the real smart grid question. And are people actually going to do it? And will it have to happen on such a large scale as the national scale, or will it have to come piece by piece?
Well, I guess my first comment is we'll never ever get real time. We'll get some granularity, you know, some increment, you know, and that'll probably increase over time as the systems evolve and we get, you know, better network capacity and better connectivity. I think there's certainly a desire to do it. We have two barriers to achieving that. One is just we do need to get the systems in place, the communication networks and all the standards protocols to enable that communication flow. And second, if you look across the country, you know, we've got 3,300 plus utilities, all kind of with different rate structures and plans and pricing models, and all of the regulatory bodies associated with those all doing things differently. So getting us to all agree to a common way to do that is one of the things we're tackling in the standards forums. So we're working on that. I don't know if I have a good answer for when.
Are there not some industrial users who already pay based on an adjustable rate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but
commercial too.
That's right, but our rates may be different than a different state's rates or different utilities' rates. So creating a system where you can have end devices that are common and that interoperate. So I'm a vendor selling, let's say, a product, and I can have a standard, you know, component that will work, you know, across multiple areas. Becomes problematic when all of the structures are different.
I think it was a Paul's slide that showed those 51 hours, was that, or is that your slide?
That was my slide.
So I think one of the things I'm seeing is an increasing understanding of the cost of service. So we absolutely have to go after those peak hours, and that varies from utility to utility, region to region, state to state. Utility I was talking to not too long ago said they looked at, you know, one of their August days at a cost of service and showed that the cost of providing a kilowatt hour at 4 o'clock in the morning was around 4 cents a kilowatt hour. The cost of providing a kilowatt hour at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on that day was about 40 cents a kilowatt hour, an order of magnitude difference. Now, that's not true of every utility across the country, but I think what we're starting to understand with better data, more granular data, is that those peak hours are typically pretty expensive to serve, and there are relatively inexpensive ways to go after those hours other than just providing that 40 cents a kilowatt hour supply.
Yeah.
I think the one area for those that are looking at research in these topics is to also consider that we're not, when we start talking about real-time pricing to the end consumer, whether it's residential, commercial, or industrial, we need to think beyond just the wholesale market price, because that is evolving pretty dramatically. There's no longer, for example, 3 prices in California. There are now 3,000 pricing nodes in California. In Texas, they went from, 4 pricing nodes to 4,000 pricing nodes. So which price are we talking about? The second is that because these loads are connected at the distribution or regional transmission, what is the price of the transmission constraint charges or transmission or distribution charges that would apply in real time in terms of managing any of the constraints into those markets? This gets very complicated when we start to disaggregate these markets down to the end use, which we do need to consider, because as we start to have more distributed resources, we need to change the paradigm from the centralized model to a much more hybrid or decentralized considerations. And that's part of what we need to work through. The communications are clearly, folks are working on that, like ourselves. Obviously, Chris is spending and Steve's spending a lot of time, but also these other structures in terms of how we think about structuring the markets, how we enable the participation in these various markets.
And of course, consumers, I think, personally, the time I want to use electricity most is on that hot summer afternoon, right? And so I don't really want to hear that the smart grid is going to allow my utility to spend more money, to charge me more money during that one time that I really, really don't want to turn anything off. But I guess, so that's another consumer issue that people have to reflect on too, in terms of selling this as a public idea.
Right.
Yeah. Questions?
Henry Dubroff, Pacific Coast Business Times. Just a follow-up to that earlier question. If my iPhone can spy on me and it only costs $49, why can't somebody build a really cheap wireless device that just spies on my house and modulates power consumption?
Anyone want?
Well, I don't know about the spying part, but there's already in place, I think as you may be aware, fairly significant discussions underway about, revisiting privacy rules and the like around the country as it relates to some of these technologies we're talking about. In fact, California has a proceeding underway at the moment. But having said that, in terms of, are there technologies that can help customers understand what their consumption is, whether they're at home, as Chris touched on in terms of the refrigerator magnet, or from an iPhone app that allows you to look at it from afar. And clearly, that is actually the case today, that those technologies exist to enable customers to look at when they're at work or maybe they're on vacation, to be able to see how much their consumption at their home. And those of you who've been, taking a look at the Chevy Volt probably are aware that the Chevy Volt has a very nice iPhone app that can actually tell you what the state of charge is on your battery from wherever you are, and also an ability to change the charging from a grid-friendly, which charges off-peak, to charge any time. So these kinds of applications are certainly possible. They're already available. We'll see more in terms of innovation.
So at Kiro's Emerging Markets and Technologies report, so Chris, you touched on one thing that I want to sort of expand on really quickly. The smart grid is a long road, and maybe at the risk of being labeled a contrarian, is this really a Sputnik moment, or is this a Rural Electrification Act, Interstate Highway Act duration, which really will require some additional legislation to really solidify the direction and guidance that's going to be needed for maybe 3, 4, potentially even 5 decades?
Well, I think we certainly are a regulated industry, right? So regulation and policy, both state and federal, play an important part. That will certainly be a part of it. I mean, I think my comment relative to a long road is, I was, when I was a kind of a baby engineer, I was involved in the early days of the internet and its migration, and where we are today, in my perspective, feels very akin to that. We're just barely trying to figure things out. I mean, I see us sitting in 1980, kind of time frame relative to the maturation of this networked machine-to-machine language, closed-loop system that kind of I talked about. So that was what I intended by that comment, right? And I would say certainly regulation and policy will be an important part of that maturation.
To some extent, it's a generational issue. So I spoke at a conference not too long ago where a couple of young utility engineers came up to me afterwards, and they were all excited about the things they were doing to change how they designed and operated their grid in a particular, this was a rural utility out in the middle of nowhere. And I was very excited to hear their excitement, and I said, well, so can I come and see all these changes that you're making? They said, well, no, it's going to take us a little while to get this done. And I said, well, so how long is a little while? And they said about 5 years. And I was like, why 5 years? Why can't you do it now? And they said, well, because in 5 years our boss will retire, and then and then we'll be able to do what we want to do, right? So there's a little bit of this generational thing where the under 35s or the under 40s, whatever the age is now, understand technology in a much different way than the engineers, including myself, that have been running the system for these past few decades.
Yeah, it's, one thing that really stood out for me as we're talking about these technologies and these standards. I kind of grew up in the Silicon Valley community, and the Crossing the Chasm book is kind of like a Bible. It's tattooed on all of our back, right? We all get it, and so I just started discussing that inside the utility sector, and they're like, what book is that, right? So that highlights a cultural difference of an industry that has had great people that have been in that industry for 35 years, but just think and apply the adoption of technology differently. So I think that generation, that cultural evolution is happening as more folks from, let's say, outside the utility industry become engaged within it.
Right. The other convergence that's happening is between the power systems engineering community and the information communication technology engineering community, and those are increasingly coming together through a lot of both in the university level, but also at the IEEE and other organizations. But better understanding what each other bring to the table in terms of ways to solve these challenges is something that's starting to happen. I'm really encouraged over particularly the last couple of years, much more engagement, much more dialogue happening, certainly at universities, increasingly looking at multidisciplinary approaches to tackle this, because as Chris touched on, many of these things involve communication, and one of the things we've been finding is that generally speaking, around the world, the power systems engineering community is somewhat deficient in their knowledge of modern networking technology and engineering practices, and there's a lot of opportunity there to really benefit from other problems that people have solved and adapting them to this space.
Great. Well, that's a perfect last question and wonderful answers. Thank you all very much for being here. Let's give our